This exercise was meant to get you comfortable moving around in Illustrator and playing with different compositions. Let's take a look at some examples to see what other things we can learn. Okay, I have a few examples of this orientation exercise here. This first one is a campfire scene in the forest, and I absolutely love it. The way that it uses such basic geometric shapes is excellent. It's just so clever, the way that this designer used triangles to make trees, and not only represent the tree, but represent the shading of the light coming off of the campfire by splitting up one triangle into two and coloring them slightly differently so that this side is brighter and this side is darker, and then using another shape to represent the actual shadow that it's casting on the ground. It's just beautiful, and I think he does a great job. And also, just the kind of flow of and the theme of the entire piece is great. Triangles are repeated over and over again. You've got them for the trees, you got it for the fire, and even the little sparks and tiny flames coming off of the fire. But then we also have some circles that are representing the light, and that makes sense. It would be casting some light off in this circular pattern coming off, and that's again mirrored with the ends of the logs. It's all just a really, really well thought out design. I think this is a great example of making something that looks really, really nice with very basic elements, and just making very intentional decisions with your design to add a lot more depth and a lot more realism for something that isn't real at all. Obviously, a campfire isn't a perfect triangle shape like that, but everything feels like one coherent piece, and the design is just very coherent. I love that. Now, if I were to change anything, it might just be a little bit of the color. I think this color scheme is fine, but I'd like to see the fire just feel a little bit warmer. Now, we haven't touched on color too much, but you're going to be getting a little bonus lesson later on this week where I cover some color tips, and you're going to see a tool that I'm about to use come up in that lesson. So I'm not going to explain exactly how this tool works right now, but it's called Recolor Artwork, and it lets you make some really powerful adjustments to your colors all at once. So I just want to add a little bit more saturation to everything by just grabbing my saturation slider and bringing it up a little bit. You see how that really just makes all these colors super saturated. I don't want to overdo this, but just bringing in a little bit more warmth to that fire, and then potentially brightening up the scene just a little bit, either through my brightness or my luminosity, probably the brightness. I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to unlink my colors, and I think I'm going to make my background color here. Yeah, that's the right one. Just back to about where it was. Maybe something like that. And I'll click OK, and this is before and after. And actually, let's just get a side by side. I'm going to copy everything, undo, paste in place, Command-Shift-V, and then move it over here so we can see the difference. Now, I did not mind the background color being as dark as it was, so maybe now what I'll do is select this color and come up to Select Same Fill Color. That way everything using that color is selected. Then I'll press the I on the keyboard to get my eyedropper and just sample that original background color one more time. And now I think that just makes all of these elements pop a little bit more. Like I said, the colors over here, there's nothing wrong with them, but I think that just bringing out a little bit more contrast in those colors, making the scene a little bit brighter and a little bit more saturated can add a little bit of a pop to the overall design. With that said, I just want to again say that this is an excellent design and a great example of what you can do with very basic shapes. Let's move on to my next example, which is this amp, this Vox amp. Very cool design, and there's a lot of really interesting things going on in this document. Some very clever use of some effects inside of Illustrator. First of all, we've got this kind of zigzag pattern showing up on the actual amp, and this reference photo over here, you can see that's basically stitching on the fabric that covers the speaker behind the amp. But the way that this designer set it up was by using straight lines. If I press Command-Y to show my outlines, see that there are just a bunch of lines across here, and just like I did with the mustard on my hot dog, this designer used the zigzag effect to produce all of these lines. So let me find that specific artwork. I'm going to lock the background. I'm going to try and get into this group right here. And it looks like the stitching is right in here, stitches. So labeling these groups helped me identify that very quickly. But let's just select one of these lines, maybe the top one, and then take a look at our properties panel. And then inside of our appearance, we see a zigzag. So the way this is set up, if I click on it, with a pretty big size, 25 pixels, so it goes up and down a lot, and it has corner points instead of smooth like I use. So if I make some adjustments here and change it to smooth, you can see how that's affecting it. And once the designer got that one zigzag looking the way that they wanted it to, they just used the eyedropper tool to apply the appearance to the other lines, or even just duplicated the lines and changed the color. Now, one little improvement that I think we could make on these zigzags is adding some dashes to the stroke, because after all, these are stitches, and I think that adding dashes is a perfect use for simulating stitches. So let's try and select all of these lines at once. I'm going to go into my layers. I think that's going to be the easiest way. And under the stitches, I'm just going to select that whole group and take a look at the stroke palette. Now, I can't change the color all at once because there's green and yellow, but I should be able to go into my stroke under Properties, open that up, and then add a dash, and there we go. It's going to add dashes to everything. Now, I want the dash to be relatively small, so probably around 8, and then maybe a gap of only 6, and we'll see what that looks like. No, I'm going to want even smaller gap. Let's say 3. There we go. Now we just have these tiny little stitches. Let's zoom out to 100%. Command 0 on the keyboard. Actually, that's zoomed to fit, but that's just fine. That stitching could even be adjusted a little more, so I'm going to undo and go back into that stroke. Let's put the dash down to say 4 and the gap to 2. And there we go. Now we've got much tighter stitches, but it's just a nice little detail to add to that actual stitching that's used in the reference image. Now, another really interesting thing that was going on in this document is this part of the cabinet. It's actually made of leather, I think, or faux leather that wraps around the cabinet. And if we look really close, it's kind of hard to see, but there actually is texture right here. And to make it a little bit easier to see, I'm going to brighten it up a little. So right here in my layers, we've got the black face group. So let me close this swatches, open that up, and then we've got a couple of different layers. So first of all, we got the background, I believe, which is just, yep, a solid black. But then we have these two scribble layers. So first thing I want to do is change their color from being so dark to just a little bit lighter shade of gray. So somewhere around there. And there we go. Now we can see it much more apparent. Now, this isn't something that the designer wanted. They didn't want that effect to be very visible, but just so we can see it and what exactly is going on, I'm going to turn it up like that. This particular effect is using the scribble effect, which is why the designer named these two layers or objects scribble. But the way that this effect works is, let me turn one of them off, and we'll just focus on the one. This is going to basically randomize the shape of your path in a very fine-tuned way that you can make a lot of adjustments with. So this first layer is set at an angle of 0, and the stroke width is turned all the way down, the spacing is turned all the way down. But if I turn the spacing up to, say, 10, and I turn the stroke width up to maybe 3, then we can see kind of what's going on. It's a little bit hard to kind of comprehend at this point, but if I change the angle around, you can kind of see that it's similar to the zigzag effect, just kind of randomly adjusting this stroke. And there's all kinds of options to mess around with here. If you want your lines to be thinner, you can increase or decrease the curviness to just get all different kinds of patterns and variation. But between this example, I'll undo to get back to the way that it was originally, and the other object on top of it that is now, both of these are visible, it kind of creates this pattern that's very similar to this leather over here. So I think that was just a really clever use of that effect to give a little bit of texture to that section of the amp. One thing I will point out is that the settings were so complex, the stroke width and the spacing were so tight that this actually takes up a decent amount of processing power. You might notice that it is a little bit more difficult to work with and slower to respond. And if I were to change this to my Pixel Preview, it's going to take my computer a bit to actually render all of these effects as pixels instead of just my vectors on top of my GPU rendering. So be aware of that some of these effects can be very intense if you turn the settings crazy high or crazy low like this, but that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't use them. You just need to be aware of that, and if that impacts your workflow, maybe do something else. But again, a really great example of just using basic shapes and clever effects to simulate different things. Let's take a look at the next example. Now this is a chair. We can see the reference image over here, a very cool design chair in a very simple background, just like my objects. I think that fits the style of the artwork, but I think there are a few things that we can do to improve this design a little bit. Some gradients were used here to give some shading on the seat cushion and the back cushion. Just going to bring this over here so we can see them both side by side. But the design itself was very minimal, and there's nothing wrong with that. I like a minimal design, but I also think that this could be a little bit better of a representation of the actual chair. One of the first things that stood out to me was that we're only seeing these two legs. So at first glance, I did not realize this was a chair. It took me a second to understand what exactly I was looking at. And I think if we made a change as simple as putting 4 legs on this chair instead of 2, it would add a lot of depth and help be a lot more identifiable as a chair. So first things first, I'm going to lock the background layers. And then I'm going to ungroup this object right here. So Command-Shift-G, and then I have access to all the layers within this. So the legs right here, I'm just going to copy and then paste in place, Command-Shift-V, and then move that down below the other pair of legs. And now I just want to scale it down a little bit. So I'm going to grab this transform handle, hold Shift, and scale it up a little. And if I scaled it, far enough to where there's a good gap between these legs and these legs, then I think my perspective is going to be way off. So I'm going to have to mess with this a little bit more, probably stretch it out, and then bring this out a little bit further to get something that looks a little bit more natural with the perspective. But now I have 4 sets of legs instead of just the 2, and that gives me a little bit more depth. Now, something else this designer did was use what are called clipping masks to do these gradients. And you can actually do this much more simply. A clip group is something that we're going to learn about a little bit later, but it's basically a way to contain one object within another. So what I need to do is select this clip group. We can see it's named clip group right here. I'm going to come up to Object, Clipping Mask, Release, and that separates the 2 objects. So this object is what was containing the gradient, and then this object is what was keeping that gradient within that shape. But we can actually put that gradient directly in this shape, no clipping mask needed. So I'm going to press I on the eyedropper and click on that shape, and now that gradient is in the actual object as the gradient fill. I can delete this, and then press G on the keyboard to switch to my gradient tool and start making adjustments to the shape of the gradient. So I could squish this down a little bit so it's more of the shape that the designer originally had, I could scale it up, reposition it, and just doing a little bit of work on this gradient can add some more realistic depth to that cushion. And I think I'd also change the shades of the gray to match the original chair a little bit better. So I'm going to come up to Window and Gradient, select the darker color, press I for the eyedropper, and then hold Shift and reference a dark part of the fabric in the original reference image. Then I'll grab the lighter color and maybe Shift click on a brighter point right about here. And then I think those colors are just going to reflect the actual source material a little bit better. And maybe I'll bring my gradient down so it's not quite so dark, bring this in a little bit, and just make some adjustments so that it fits the shape of that chair a little bit more. Now, if I wanted to really make this a lot more accurate, I would probably break up the armrests into different shapes just so I could have more accurate shading. Even though in reality that is one cushion, I'd be able to make those armrests pop out and give them a little bit more dimension if I was using multiple shapes. Now that that's done, I'm going to grab the seat cushion and do the same thing. Object, Clipping Mask, Release. Get rid of that gradient shape and then just sample the appearance of this one, switch to my gradient tool, and again just modify this slightly to fit the shape of the cushion a little bit more. So maybe this one will go up, something like that. There we go. Now this designer did use a gradient on the legs, and I think that's great. That adds some shading to the actual seat, the part of the seat that's covering the legs. But again, this is done with a clipping group, and we can really simplify this. So I'm going to go to Object, Clipping Path, Release, Clipping Mask Release, and then just sample that gradient, and then redraw the gradient by pressing G on the keyboard, clicking and dragging, and I need to go in the opposite direction. But there we go. Now we have something very similar on a less complex object. I'll actually just get rid of the one that I copied back there. Copy, and then this time I'm going to use a new keyboard shortcut. It's Command B, and that's paste behind. It'll paste it exactly where you copied it from, but behind whatever object you have selected. All right, let's scale this down a little bit again. Bring it up. And I think that's going to work. Now I want to make it a little bit darker, but I think I can do that just by grabbing my gradient and then dragging it down a little bit. And that way it separates the two legs just a little bit more. There we have a little bit more dimension. And then finally we've got the base of the seat that's actually made out of wood. I want to make this a little bit thicker to add some dimension to it as well. Right now it's being done just using a stroke, but I want to convert this to a fill. The way I'm going to do this is by pressing Command C to copy, Command Shift V to paste, and then scale it all down just a little bit. And then I want to select both shapes and join them. Command J once, that joins this side. Command J one more time, that joins that side, and I'll just make sure it goes down below the cushion. Then I'm going to swap my fill and my stroke, and then probably modify the path a little. So I'm going to double click on it to go into isolation mode so I don't modify anything else, and then grab my direct selection tool, grab these points here and these points here, press S to get to my scale tool, click and drag while holding shift to bring those in a bit, and then select these outer points, S again, scale them out a little bit, maybe not quite that much, right about there. And there we go. Now we've just added a little bit more dimension to that chair. Since we're using gradients for everything else, I think I'm going to go ahead and try and do that on this chair just to give it some more depth. And this is a linear gradient. I want it to be a radial gradient. There we go. And then I want to swap so that the darker section is on the inside and the lighter is on the outside. Bring the darker in just a little bit further. And there we go. Now we've got some more depth to those sides, and I think we've made some pretty good progress in making this a better representation of the actual chair. The last thing I want to point out on this particular design is the font that was chosen for the word relax. It's a very delicate font. I think it's a beautiful font, but I don't think it was the best choice for this particular design because I'm viewing it at 100% right now, and you'll notice that these tiny little lines right here in the A and the X are very, very hard to see. And if I zoom out at all, it almost disappears into the background. This is something you need to be very aware of when you're choosing a font, is how readable it's going to be. So I think we should probably just choose a different font. Let me click on that and just limit to my Typekit fonts. And let's just see if we can find something that's a little bit similar to what we had, but more legible. So this one right here is a little bit more scripty. Let me get this out of the way so we can actually see what's going on. The one that we have is called Lust. I believe that has multiple versions. But all of those lines, especially the serifs are these little feet on the top and bottom, those are very, very thin on this particular font. So let's see if we can just find an alternate that might work a little bit better. I can even narrow this down by saying something like a serif font. And this first one that it came up with is actually very similar, but it just has thicker serifs. So this is before, this is after. And I think even just that simple little change can make it much more legible and helps it work better as a design. Okay, let's move on to the last example, which I want to just show you because it's just a fantastic example of how if you just keep adding little details with basic shapes, you can make something that looks very complex and very beautiful. This is a boombox, obviously, that was just made up of tons of little shapes. Circles, rectangles, tiny little lines with strokes on them. We've got some highlighting in here using opacities at these angles that just really add a nice bit of dimension to the overall design and some style. I love how the background kind of works as almost like this light burst. All of these angled lines are drawing your attention directly to the center of this speaker. The boombox text is laid over on the side. It balances out the composition. This is just a really, really effective use of the basic shape tools inside of Illustrator. If I zoom in nice and close here, you can see that, again, even just something as simple as a knob or a dial on a speaker can be made up of just very simple shapes, like all of these lines repeated in a pattern. We've got the little shape to do this kind of diagonal, diamond-shaped highlight, but everything else is made up of circles and using gradients effectively to add a little bit of depth with that shading. I think this is just a really great project for this assignment. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at your making connections exercises. Hopefully, you're already starting to get the hang of using Illustrator, and this assignment was meant to challenge your technical skills and to give you tons of practice with the pen tool. Let's take a look at some of your sessions' work.